I remember the dust first. Not the sound of the mortar, not the shouting, just that choking, chalky Afghan dust settling over the forward operating base. We had just survived a perimeter attack outside Kandahar. My ears were still ringing, my uniform smelled like cordite and sweat, and the adrenaline was still humming in my jaw when the communications officer handed me the satellite phone. "Captain Sarah Mercer," I said, my voice hoarse. Then I heard Mark. He was sobbing. Not the quiet, dignified kind, but a frantic, jagged sound that instantly made my stomach drop into my boots. "Sarah," he gasped, his voice breaking so hard I could barely understand the words. "It's Chloe. She's gone." I stood there in the middle of a literal war zone, surrounded by body armor and concrete barriers, and I actually looked around like maybe somebody nearby had misunderstood a radio transmission. That's how your mind protects you for about 3 seconds before the truth kicks the door in. "What do you mean, gone?" I asked him, my fingers gripping the plastic casing of the phone until my knuckles went white. "She got sick so fast," Mark cried. "The flu. It turned into an aggressive pneumonia. The doctors couldn't stop it. Her lungs just gave out." My daughter was 8 years old. 8. She had a gap between her front teeth, a purple backpack she dragged everywhere, and a habit of sorting her M&Ms by color before eating them. I told him to put the doctor on the phone. "She's already been moved," he said, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the Kevlar vest I was wearing. The ambient noise of the bass faded into a deafening, high-pitched whine. My knees hit the dirt. I don't remember dropping the phone. The journey back to Tennessee was a bureaucratic, agonizing blur. Emergency leave is not an instant magic trick. There were forms, transport schedules, endless waits on the cold metal benches of C-17 cargo planes, and well-meaning chaplains offering coffee I couldn't drink. I spent 48 hours staring at bulkheads, my brain packed with wet cotton, repeating my daughter's name like a prayer. By the time Mark picked me up at McGee-Tyson Airport, the funeral was already over. I stared at him in the passenger seat of his truck. "You buried her before I got home?" His jaw tightened, playing the role of the shattered father perfectly. "The hospital urged an immediate closed casket, Sarah. The illness, it affected her body. The funeral director agreed. I didn't want you to see her like that." He said it like mercy. I heard it like theft. When we pulled into our driveway, the house didn't feel like home. It felt like a crime scene that had been bleached. I went straight to Chloe's room, desperate for the smell of her shampoo, the sight of her messy sheets. Instead, I found Mark surrounded by heavy black trash bags. Half her closet was already empty. Her bedding was stripped. "What the hell are you doing?" I asked, my voice shaking. Mark didn't flinch. He looked at me with this manufactured, condescending pity. "I'm protecting you," he said softly, taping a box shut. "Seeing her things will push you over the edge, Sarah. You're exhausted. The army already made you unstable. You have combat stress. If you sit in here surrounded by her toys, you'll lose your mind. I'm doing this for us." He was trying to erase her, and he was using my uniform as the excuse. I was too exhausted and broken to fight him. I folded. Later that night, the house was suffocatingly quiet. Mark was asleep in the guest room, playing the grieving martyr. I crept back into Chloe's stripped bedroom and sat on the bare mattress. I found Captain Bun, her favorite stuffed rabbit with the crooked stitched ear, sitting on the windowsill. I pulled it to my chest and curled into a ball on the floor, as I lay there crying the kind of ugly, silent tears that burn your throat. My hand brushed against something kicked far under the bed. I pulled it out. It wasn't a toy. It was a crumpled receipt from a luxury hotel downtown, dated 3 weeks ago. 2 glasses of wine charged to the room. Wrapped inside the receipt was a tube of expensive cherry red lipstick. I don't wear red lipstick. The military doesn't exactly encourage it. I walked into the guest room and turned on the overhead light. I threw the receipt and the lipstick onto Mark's chest. He woke up, disoriented, blinking against the harsh glare. He looked at the items, then at me. The panic in his eyes only lasted a second before the fake tears started again. "Sarah, please," he stammered. "Her name is Jessica. It didn't mean anything." "My daughter is dead," I whispered, my voice completely hollow. "And you're sleeping with someone else." Mark sat up, running his hands through his hair, turning the weapon back on me. "I was drowning, Sarah. You were always gone. You chose your deployments over us. The crushing loneliness. I just needed someone to talk to while you were off playing hero." I didn't scream. I didn't throw plates. I was too tired for theater. "I'll have my lawyer call you," I said. 2 weeks later, I filed for divorce. I packed my duffel bags, walked out of that house, and never looked back. I medically retired from active duty shortly after. My lower back was shot, my right knee clicked on every stair, and my spirit was completely dead. I moved into a run-down, cramped duplex across town because I felt I didn't deserve any better. For the next year, I existed as a ghost of my former self. Every Sunday, I drove to Maple Ridge Cemetery, sitting by a cold marble stone, bringing Kroger flowers, apologizing to a grave that, unbeknownst to me, held nothing but a catastrophic lie. A year is a strange measurement of time when you are grieving. It feels like an eternity, yet simultaneously the pain is as sharp as the day it was inflicted. It was late November. The Tennessee air had turned bitter and cruel, biting through my thin jacket as freezing rain slicked the dead grass of Maple Ridge Cemetery. I sat on a rusty folding stool in front of the marble headstone that read, "Chloe Grace Mercer, beloved daughter." I was talking to the stone, tracing the carved letters with numb fingers, telling her about a stray dog I had seen or how the heat in my duplex was broken again. Just mindless, empty words to fill the vacuum of my life. Through the relentless drizzle, I heard a twig snap. I turned. Standing behind the trunk of a massive, dying oak tree was a little boy. He looked maybe 9 years old. He was scruffy, wearing a faded hoodie that was 2 sizes too big and soaked through with rain. He was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. "You need something, sweetheart?" I asked, my voice rough from the cold. He didn't answer. He just shrank back against the bark, his gaze darting frantically toward the cemetery gates. I followed his line of sight. Slowly crawling down the perimeter road was a familiar black Ford F-150, Mark's truck. My blood ran cold. Even a year later, the sight of his vehicle made my chest tight. He was rolling at a creeping pace, peering through the rain-streaked windows, patrolling the grounds, making sure his narrative was undisturbed, making sure I was exactly where I was supposed to be, broken, isolated, and weeping over a patch of dirt. We both held our breath until the truck's taillights vanished around the bend. The boy finally stepped out from behind the tree. He was trembling, though, whether from the freezing rain or pure fear. I couldn't tell. He took a hesitant step toward me, his eyes dropping to the glossy, laminated photograph of Chloe I had propped against the base of the headstone. It was my favorite picture of her, wearing my oversized patrol cap, grinning a toothy, radiant smile. "What's your name?" I asked gently, trying not to spook him. "Leo," he whispered. "Where are your parents, Leo? It's freezing out here." He ignored the question. He stepped closer, his worn sneakers sinking into the mud. He pointed a shaking, dirt-smudged finger at the photograph. His voice, when it came, was so quiet, the rain almost drowned it out. "Ma'am, that girl in your picture." "Yes?" I asked, my heart giving a strange, pathetic flutter. "That's my daughter, Chloe. My husband told me she died last year." Leo swallowed hard, looking over his shoulder one last time before locking eyes with me. "She isn't dead." The world stopped spinning, the rain seemed to freeze in midair. "What did you say?" Leo took a step back, but he didn't run. "She isn't dead," he repeated, his voice gaining a fraction of desperate strength. "She lives near my grandma's trailer. She calls herself Emma. There is a specific kind of shock that completely bypasses your brain and hijacks your nervous system." My vision tunneled. I didn't question him. I didn't demand proof. I just grabbed his hand, threw my folding stool into the back of my rusted Jeep, and told him to show me the way. The drive was a blur of gray skies and swerving wiper blades. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles popped, following Leo's frantic staccato directions out into the rural fringes of the county. We turned off the paved highway onto a deeply rutted, unmapped gravel road that looked like the world had forgotten it existed. We pulled into a dilapidated, off-the-grid trailer park tucked beneath a canopy of rotting pine trees. Rusted mailboxes, collapsed porches, and sinking foundations lined the dirt path. Leo pointed to a faded beige, single-wide at the very end of the row. Standing on the porch, waiting for us before I even cut the engine, was an older woman. She was in her 70s, with iron gray hair pulled back tight and a face carved by hard years. She leaned heavily on a thick wooden cane, but the look in her eyes was sharper than barbed wire. I practically fell out of the Jeep. "Ma'am!" "Martha," she interrupted, her voice gravelly and commanding. "And I know exactly who you are, Captain Mercer. Get inside before the whole park starts watching." The inside of the trailer smelled of Vicks Vapor Rub, old coffee, and damp wool. It was small, crowded, but fiercely clean. I stood in the center of the cramped living room, dripping rainwater onto the linoleum, gasping for air. "Where is she? Where is my daughter?" Martha sank heavily into a worn recliner, resting both hands on the head of her cane. She studied me for a long, agonizing moment, weighing my soul. Finally, she exhaled. "She's at school. The bus drops off at the corner in 10 minutes. Martha pointed her cane at a cheap plastic chair. "Sit down before you fall down. You need to hear this first." I sat, my knees barely supporting me. "It was mid-January," Martha began, her tone dead serious. "Freezing cold, ice on the roads. I was taking the trash out behind Ruthie's diner after closing, and I saw something moving behind the dumpsters. It was a little girl. She was shivering so hard her teeth were chipping, wearing a hospital gown and a thin jacket that wasn't hers." My stomach violently heaved. "January? Her funeral was January 15th. Martha nodded grimly. "That timeline fits. When I found her, she was having a panic attack, hiding from a white passenger van that kept circling the block. It had a logo on the side, New Harbor Family Outreach, a church group." "A church group?" I whispered, my mind reeling. "Why didn't you call the police?" "I tried," Martha snapped, her eyes flashing. "But the child screamed bloody murder when I touched the phone. She said the police would give her back to her daddy, and her daddy was giving her to the church people. I know the foster system around here, Captain. I know what happens to problem kids who get dumped into unregulated religious outreach programs. I've lived long enough to smell a rat. So I took her in, I kept her hidden, I kept her alive. She had been here. Alive." Shivering behind a dumpster while Mark stood at a polished mahogany podium receiving condolences and casserole dishes. A dark, terrifying rage began to bloom at the base of my skull. Before I could ask another question, the groan of hydraulic brakes echoed from the main road. "The school bus." "She's here," Leo whispered, peering through the blinds. Every muscle in my body went rigid. I stood up, my breath caught entirely in my throat. I heard the crunch of gravel outside, the metallic squeak of the screen door opening, and then she was there. Chloe. She was taller. Her hair was longer, unkempt, falling across her face. She looked painfully thin, wearing a hand-me-down sweater that swallowed her frame. But it was her. The birthmark near her jaw, the way she gripped the strap of her backpack. It was my baby. My living, breathing child. "Chloe," I sobbed. The word felt like a physical weight leaving my chest. I fell to my knees right there on the cheap linoleum floor, tears blinding me, reaching both of my arms out to her. "Baby, oh my God, baby, I'm here. My God. Baby, I waited for the rush of footsteps. I waited for her to collide with my chest, for the cinematic, tearful embrace that kept me going through a year of hell. Instead, Chloe froze. Her eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated terror. She dropped her backpack. The color completely drained from her face. She took a step back, hitting the screen door. "No," she whimpered. Then she screamed, not a cry of surprise, but a raw, primal shriek of panic. She scrambled away from me, diving behind Martha's recliner, clutching the older woman's sleeve as if I were a predator about to strike. "Don't let her take me!" Chloe shrieked, her little body convulsing with hyperventilation. "Martha, please, no!" "Chloe, baby, it's Mommy," I pleaded, crawling a foot forward, my heart shattering into a million jagged pieces. "No!" she screamed, burying her face in Martha's hip. "Daddy told me! Daddy said she turned into a monster in the war. He said she went crazy and she threw me away because I was too much trouble. He said she wanted me dead. Don't let her touch me." The room spun. I stopped crawling. My hands fell limp against the floor. Mark didn't just hide her. He didn't just sell her off to a shady organization. He had systematically, ruthlessly poisoned her mind. He had taken the most sacred thing in the world, a child's trust in her mother, and weaponized it to ensure she would never come looking for me. He made her fear the only person who would die to protect her. I couldn't breathe. The agony of that realization was worse than the phone call in Afghanistan. It was a wound so deep it felt terminal. I didn't lunge for her. I didn't try to force a hug or desperately plead my case to a traumatized 8-year-old. My army training, or perhaps just the sheer instinct of a mother, took over. I pulled my hands back, pressing them against my own chest so she knew I wasn't going to grab her. I sat back on my heels. I closed my eyes, letting the tears stream freely down my face, and I started to sing, very softly, barely a whisper over the sound of her frantic sobbing. It was a silly, off-key lullaby about a sailor in a paper boat, a song my father used to sing to me, and the only song I ever sang to Chloe to calm her down after thunderstorms. I sang it when she was an infant. I sang it through crackling Skype connections from Kandahar. "Sail away, little bird, the storm has passed you by." I sang it 3 times, my voice breaking on every other note. Slowly, the frantic gasping from behind the chair began to quiet. I kept my eyes on the floor, singing, proving I wasn't a threat, just a broken woman on the ground. I heard the soft shuffle of a sneaker against the linoleum. Then another. I didn't look up. I didn't move. A tiny, trembling hand entered my field of vision. It reached out, hovering in the air for a terrifying eternity, before 2 small fingers gently, agonizingly, touched the wet skin of my cheek, like she was verifying a ghost. "Mommy?" she whispered, her voice cracking. I placed my hand over hers, pressing it to my face, and nodded. "I didn't throw you away, my sweet girl. I never stopped looking for you." And there, on the floor of a stranger's trailer, holding the hand of the daughter I had mourned for a year, the grief finally ended, and the war began. The grief was gone, burned away entirely. In its place, a cold, hyper-focused fury settled into my bones. I wasn't a weeping, broken mother anymore. I was a United States Army captain, and I had just found my target. But you don't go into a war zone without a battle plan, and you don't strike a sociopath without overwhelming firepower. Mark was a manipulator who had already convinced a hospital, a funeral director, a church charity, and half the county that he was a tragic hero. If I just kicked his door down and screamed the truth, he would spin it. He would use my outburst as proof of my combat-induced psychosis. I needed someone who knew how to dismantle a lie paper by paper. I needed David. David and I had served 2 tours together. He was a former Criminal Investigation Division CID investigator, a massive, quiet man who possessed the moral patience of a saint and the relentless persistence of a bloodhound. He didn't do sympathy. He did evidence. Within 24 hours, David drove up from Kentucky and transformed Martha's cramped, faded trailer kitchen into a makeshift war room. Martha kept Chloe occupied in the back room with jigsaw puzzles and old cartoons, fiercely guarding the hallway with her cane while David and I went to work under the flickering fluorescent kitchen light. "How do you fake a child's death, David?" I asked, staring at a printout of the obituary Mark had run in the local paper. "How does a man bury an empty coffin without a single official asking to see the body?" "You don't do it alone," David said, his thick finger tracing a line on his legal pad. "And you don't do it for free. People look the other way when the paperwork is clean and the money is right." For 3 days, we barely slept. We survived on Martha's black coffee and sheer adrenaline, hacking through a jungle of county filings, property records, and medical databases. David utilized contacts he technically wasn't supposed to have anymore, pulling strings in the darkest corners of the local bureaucracy. Slowly, the sickening anatomy of the crime revealed itself. Motive, David muttered on the third night, slapping a thick stack of printed county records onto the linoleum table. It's always money, Sarah. Look at this. I pulled the documents closer, my chest tightened. It was a copy of my late father's estate. When my dad passed, he had bypassed Mark entirely. He never trusted him, and left a substantial trust fund along with 12 acres of highly valuable commercial zoned real estate directly to Chloe. I was the sole executor until she turned 18. If Chloe died, the estate reverted to me. But I didn't touch it, I said, my voice rising in confusion. I haven't even looked at those accounts since the funeral. You didn't, David said grimly. Mark did. He slid another piece of paper across the table. It was a petition filed in county court, heavily stamped and notarized. I stared at the words, feeling a wave of absolute nausea wash over me. It was a psychiatric evaluation, bearing a forged signature from a military doctor. It detailed my supposed severe combat PTSD, erratic behavioral swings, and homicidal ideation. Attached to it was a power of attorney, claiming I was completely emotionally unfit to manage affairs from overseas. And below that, a sworn affidavit stating I had voluntarily relinquished all maternal rights and financial control due to my trauma. He told the courts you abandoned her, David said quietly. He faked the death to cut her out of the picture, and he faked your insanity to take control of the assets. He's already started liquidating the land. He sold the first 4 acres to a developer a month ago. I dug my fingernails into my palms so hard they bled. He didn't just break my heart. He had meticulously assassinated my character, painted me as a monster, and sold my daughter's future to fund his new life with Jessica. We take this to the police, I said, standing up. Right now. No, David said, catching my wrist. It's circumstantial. Mark is slippery. He'll say you forged this to frame him out of bitter jealousy over the divorce. We need a smoking gun. We need him on tape, admitting to the psychological manipulation. And we need to find the bridge, the exact link between Mark and that church van Martha saw. David looked at me, his expression hardening into pure tactical assessment. You have to go into the lion's den, Sarah. You have to bait him. The next evening, I stood in the parking lot of a strip mall while David taped a high-grade, covert microphone to my ribs, running the wire seamlessly under my dark sweater. Every breath I took felt restricted, not by the tape, but by the sheer, suffocating dread of what I was about to do. Keep him talking, David instructed, checking the audio feed on his receiver. Play the broken, desperate ex-wife. Let him think he holds all the cards. Sociopaths love to monologue when they feel superior. Get him to threaten you. Get him to mention the estate. I drove my rusted Jeep to the upscale suburban neighborhood I used to call home. The house looked different. The front door had been painted a cheerful robin's egg blue, Jessica's touch, no doubt. Potted ferns lined the immaculate porch. It looked like a magazine cover. It looked like a house that had never known the sound of a terrified child screaming in the dark. I rang the doorbell. Mark opened the door. He was wearing a casual, expensive cashmere sweater, holding a half-empty glass of red wine. When he saw me, his casual smile froze, instantly replaced by a mask of measured, calculated concern. But my eyes didn't stop on his face. They dropped to his chest. Resting against the cashmere was a silver pendant, a tiny engraved swallow. I had bought that necklace for Chloe in a bazaar in Kabul. I had mailed it to her for her 7th birthday. He was wearing my dead daughter's necklace as an accessory. It took every ounce of military discipline I possessed not to drive my fist directly through his throat. Sarah, he said, his voice dripping with faux gentleness. What are you doing here? It's late. I needed to see you, Mark, I said, letting my voice waver perfectly, widening my eyes to mimic the desperate, erratic woman he had convinced the world I was. I've been having the dreams again. The ones about Chloe. I can't stop thinking about her room. He sighed, a heavy, theatrical sound of a burdened man. He stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in, just for a minute. Jessica is out with friends." I walked into my former home. The scent of lemon cleaner and expensive vanilla candles made my stomach churn. The house was dead quiet. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked like a metronome for an execution. Mark poured me a glass of wine I didn't touch. We sat across from each other in the living room. "You look exhausted, Sarah," he said smoothly, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Are you taking your medication? The VA doctor said you needed to stay on top of that." "I don't need medication, Mark. I need my daughter." I let a tear spill over my eyelashes. "Why didn't you let me see her before they closed the casket? Why?" Mark's jaw twitched. He took a sip of his wine, his eyes darting toward the hallway, then back to me. The benevolent mask began to slip just a fraction. He was annoyed that his neatly buried past was sitting on his new leather sofa. "We've been over this," he said, his tone hardening. "You were overseas, you were unstable, you still are. Look at you, showing up here unannounced, talking about a child we lost a year ago like it happened yesterday." "I just want to know what happened to the trust, Mark." I pivoted sharply, throwing the bait exactly where David had instructed. "The lawyer sent me a letter. My dad's land is being sold." "Why?" The air in the room instantly dropped 10 degrees. Mark slowly placed his wine glass on the coffee table. He leaned back, his eyes narrowing into cold, predatory slits. He didn't look like a grieving father anymore. He looked like a cornered snake deciding whether to strike. "That land was a burden," he said quietly. "It was sitting there, collecting taxes. I am managing it, Sarah. Just like I managed everything else while you abandoned us to play soldier. You forged my signature, Mark. You told the court I relinquished my rights." Mark laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound that sent a chill straight down my spine. He leaned in close, so close I could smell the tannins of the wine on his breath. "Sarah, listen to me very carefully," he whispered, his voice smooth as riverstone and twice as hard. "Nobody is going to believe a word you say. You are a traumatized, discharged veteran with a documented history of combat stress. I am a respected businessman who suffered a devastating tragedy. If you keep coming around here, if you keep making up these paranoid delusions about forged documents and trusts," he reached out, his thumb brushing menacingly over my knee. "You need to move on, Sarah, because if you keep talking about Chloe like she's still here, people are going to think you've lost your mind completely. And I would hate, as your concerned former husband, to have to make a call to the VA and have you committed to a psychiatric ward for your own safety." "Gotcha." The wire caught every single syllable, every threat, every admission of control. I stood up slowly, keeping my face perfectly devoid of emotion. "You're right, Mark. I should go." I walked out the front door, my heart hammering against my ribs so violently I thought the microphone would pick it up. I got into my Jeep, drove 2 blocks away, and pulled over. David opened the passenger door and slid in, pulling the headphones off his ears. He didn't smile, but his eyes burned with a fierce, dark triumph. "We got the threat. We got the motive. Now we find the bridge." The bridge came at midnight 2 nights later. David had been running a deep dive trace on Mark's recent banking activity, looking for any anomalies. He found a recurring, hidden transfer. $300 every month, routed through a Shell LLC into a rental agreement for a self-storage facility on the industrial edge of Knox County. The unit was registered under Jessica's maiden name. "People get sloppy," David told me as we sped down the empty highway toward the facility. "They think digital trails vanish, so they keep the physical paper because they're greedy. They keep ledgers, they keep receipts. Whatever is in that unit is the link to the church." But we weren't the only ones who knew the net was closing. As we pulled onto the cracked asphalt of the storage facility, the stench of raw gasoline and melting plastic hit us through the Jeep's air vents. "Damn it," David roared. Unit 42, near the back fence, was actively vomiting thick black smoke into the night sky. Bright orange flames licked up the sides of the corrugated metal door. Jessica had panicked. Mark must have realized I was digging into the trust and ordered her to scorch the earth. I slammed the Jeep into park. David was out of the vehicle before it even fully stopped. "David, wait! It's too hot!" I screamed, running after him. He didn't hesitate. David, a man who had kicked down doors in Fallujah, sprinted toward the blazing unit. The cheap padlock had already melted, but the metal door was jammed. He reared back and drove his heavy combat boot directly into the center of the corrugated steel. Once, twice. With a massive, tearing screech, the door buckled inward. A wave of blistering heat rolled over us, singeing the hair on my arms. Inside, cardboard boxes were completely engulfed, burning into gray ash. "There!" David shouted, pointing through the smoke. Sitting in the very back corner, away from the worst of the flames, was a heavy industrial steel lockbox. David pulled his jacket up over his mouth and nose and dove straight into the smoke. I watched in absolute terror as the flames curled around the ceiling. 10 seconds felt like an hour. Then he emerged, coughing violently, his jacket smoking, dragging the metal lockbox across the concrete. He heaved it onto the hood of my Jeep just as the distant wail of fire engines echoed in the night. "Get the crowbar from the trunk," he gasped, swatting a smoldering ember off his sleeve. I grabbed the iron bar and jammed it under the lockbox lid. With both of us throwing our entire body weight onto it, the metal shrieked and the latch snapped. We threw the lid open. The heat had warped the edges of the papers inside, and the smell of charred paper was overwhelming, but the center of the documents had survived. I reached in with trembling hands. The first file contained the original intake forms. The logo at the top made my blood freeze. New Harbor Family Outreach. Temporary Guardianship Agreement. Mark's signature was clearly scrawled at the bottom, legally transferring custody of a troubled, abandoned minor named Emma Miller into their unregulated system, in exchange for a massive, untraceable, charitable donation. But it was the second item in the box that finally, permanently broke the dam. It was a glossy 8x10 photograph. It was taken inside a cheap, beige church office. In the foreground, Mark was shaking hands with a woman wearing a New Harbor name tag, accepting a thick manila envelope full of cash. But in the background, sitting on a metal folding chair, clutching her purple backpack to her chest, was Chloe. She looked small, utterly defeated and terrified. She was looking directly at the camera, her eyes red from crying. I looked down at the bottom right corner of the photograph. The digital timestamp was printed in bright yellow text. January 18th, 3 days after I had stood in a cemetery sobbing over an empty casket. 3 days after he had told me she was dead. He had sold my living child into a nightmare while I was mourning her ghost. I stared at the photo, the flames of the storage unit reflecting in my eyes. The soldier and the mother inside me finally merged into one terrifying, unstoppable force. David looked at me over the hood of the Jeep, his face smeared with soot. "We have the gun, Sarah, and it's smoking." I carefully placed the photo back into the lockbox. "Call the state investigators," I said, my voice dead calm, devoid of any fear or hesitation. "Tell them to put on their best suits. We're going to a party." There is a unique, sickening flavor to high society hypocrisy. It tastes like expensive champagne and smells like roasted tenderloin served in a room built on a foundation of absolute lies. The crystal ballroom at the downtown Marriott was dripping in opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over 50 circular tables draped in heavy white silk. The centerpieces were towering arrangements of white lilies. The attendees were a sea of tailored tuxedos and designer evening gowns. The wealthy elite, local politicians, and prominent church donors of Knox County. The banner draped across the stage read, "The New Harbor Foundation Annual Gala Protecting Our Vulnerable Children." Standing near the service doors in the back, shrouded in the dim lighting, I watched my ex-husband work the room. Mark was in his element. He wore a sharp navy blue tuxedo, holding a glass of sparkling water, nodding solemnly as a state senator patted him on the shoulder. Jessica stood beside him in a glittering emerald dress, playing the supportive, tragic partner to perfection. He was the guest of honor, slated to receive the Courage in the Face of Loss award, an event heavily funded by the very trust money he had stolen from his supposedly dead daughter. I wasn't in uniform, but I felt like I was back in a combat zone. My heart was a steady, rhythmic drum against my ribs. David stood a few feet to my right, wearing a dark suit that barely contained his massive frame. He caught my eye and gave a single sharp nod. Positioned subtly near the two main exits were plainclothes state investigators waiting for our signal. Out in the carpeted hallway, out of sight, Martha was waiting with Chloe. The lights in the ballroom dimmed. A gentle, mournful piano melody began to play through the state-of-the-art sound system. The master of ceremonies stepped up to the mahogany podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," the MC intoned, his voice echoing through the hushed room. "Tonight, we honor a man who took the most unimaginable tragedy a parent can face and turned his grief into a beacon of hope for abandoned children. Please welcome to the stage, Mark Mercer." The applause was deafening. It rolled through the room like a wave as Mark walked up the steps to the stage. He adjusted the microphone. Behind him, a massive projector screen flickered to life, displaying a beautifully edited slow-motion montage of Chloe. My Chloe. A photo of her blowing out birthday candles. A video of her running through a sprinkler. I dug my fingernails into my palms until the skin nearly broke. "Thank you," Mark said, his voice thick with perfectly manufactured emotion. "A year ago, I lost my world. When my beautiful Chloe was taken by illness, I didn't think I would survive the grief. Especially—" He paused, letting his head drop for a moment of calculated vulnerability. "Especially doing it alone. With Chloe's mother battling her own severe combat-induced demons overseas, the burden of saying goodbye fell entirely on me. But through New Harbor outreach, I learned that while I couldn't save my daughter, I could save others." People in the front row were actually wiping away tears. I looked at David now. David slipped seamlessly through a side door leading to the AV control booth. Mark took a deep breath, preparing for his grand crescendo. "Sometimes God asks us to endure unimaginable pain so we can—" A massive, ear-splitting screech of audio feedback ripped through the ballroom. The donors flinched, covering their ears. Mark tapped the microphone, frowning in annoyance. "Apologies, folks. A little technical difficulty." But it wasn't technical difficulty. David had completely hijacked the soundboard. The mournful piano music abruptly cut out. For 2 seconds, there was dead silence. Then, a voice boomed from the massive overhead speakers. It was crisp, clear, and undeniably Mark's. That land was a burden. It was sitting there, collecting taxes. "I am managing it, Sarah, just like I managed everything else while you abandoned us to play soldier." The ballroom froze. The clinking of silverware stopped. Mark's face instantly drained of color. He looked wildly toward the sound booth, but the door was locked from the inside. My voice echoed next, the covert recording from 2 nights ago crystal clear. "You forged my signature, Mark. You told the court I relinquished my rights." Then came Mark's dry, chilling laugh. The sociopathic whisper that had terrified me in my own living room now filled the massive, vaulted ballroom for 500 wealthy donors to hear. "Nobody is going to believe a word you say. You are a traumatized, discharged veteran. If you keep talking about Chloe like she's still here, people are going to think you've lost your mind completely. And I would hate to have to make a call to the VA and have you committed to a psychiatric ward." The collective gasp from the audience sucked the oxygen out of the room. A woman at a nearby table dropped her champagne flute. It shattered loudly against the floor. On stage, the mask of the grieving father didn't just slip, it disintegrated. Mark panicked. He scrambled backward, his eyes scanning the dark perimeter of the room until they locked onto me standing by the service doors. "Turn that off!" Mark screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Security, grab her! She did this! She's having a psychotic break. She's an armed veteran. She's dangerous." 2 uniformed hotel security guards at the edge of the room took a hesitant step toward me. Before they could close the distance, the grand, heavy mahogany double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom violently swung open. They hit the walls with a thunderous crack. Every head in the room whipped around. Standing in the doorway, bathed in the hallway light, was Martha. She stood like a titan, leaning heavily on her wooden cane, and gripping her left hand wearing a simple blue dress was Chloe. For 3 seconds, Absolute, suffocating silence reigned over the room. The giant projected photo of the dead little girl on the stage behind Mark stared down at the very real, very alive little girl standing in the doorway. Chloe looked across the sea of tables. Her eyes bypassed the strangers, bypassed the glittering chandeliers, and locked onto Mark standing on the stage. "Chloe," Mark whispered, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic squeak. Chloe let go of Martha's hand. She didn't cower. The year of terror, the months of hiding behind dumpsters, the brainwashing, it all shattered the moment she saw the man who had done it to her, cornered like a rat. She ran down the center aisle. She didn't run to him. She ran straight toward me, but as she passed the center tables, she stopped, grabbed an abandoned microphone stand left by a string quartet, and looked up at the stage. "You told me my mommy didn't love me!" Chloe screamed, her voice tearing through the silence with the raw, devastating power of a wounded animal. "You gave me to the church people. You locked me in the dark." The ballroom erupted. It was pure, unadulterated chaos. Donors were shouting. Politicians were scrambling out of their chairs, backing away from the stage as if Mark were suddenly radioactive. Jessica, her face pale as a sheet, tried to sprint for the side exit, but David stepped out of the AV booth and slammed his massive arm across the doorway, blocking her path. "Sit down," David growled. Jessica collapsed against the wall, sobbing hysterically. On stage, the reality of his total destruction finally registered in Mark's eyes. The money, the reputation, the freedom, it was all gone. Driven by pure cowardly panic, he leaped off the side of the stage, trying to scramble toward the kitchen service hallway. He didn't make it 3 steps. Martha had moved down the aisle faster than a woman her age had any right to. As Mark lunged toward the exit, Martha stepped squarely into his path, planted her feet, gripped her heavy wooden cane with both hands like a baseball bat, and swung. The thick wood connected squarely with Mark's jaw with a sickening crunch. Mark's eyes rolled back in his head, and he crumpled to the carpeted floor like a sack of wet concrete, spitting blood onto his pristine tuxedo shirt. "That," Martha snarled, standing over his groaning body, "is for the dumpster, you son of a bitch." Before Mark could even attempt to get to his hands and knees, the plainclothes state investigators swarmed him. They grabbed him by the lapels of his tuxedo, violently slamming him face first onto the floor. The metallic, rhythmic clicks of handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed over the shouting crowd. "Mark Mercer, you are under arrest for fraud, extortion, child endangerment, and false imprisonment. You have the right to remain silent," an investigator barked, pressing his knee squarely between Mark's shoulder blades. I didn't care about the arrest. I didn't care about the donors, or the screaming, or the flashing lights of the police cruisers already pulling up outside the hotel windows. I was on my knees on the ballroom floor, gathering my daughter into my arms. Chloe buried her face in my neck, wrapping her arms around me so tight I could barely breathe. She was sobbing, but they weren't tears of terror anymore. They were tears of profound, overwhelming relief. I buried my face in her hair, smelling the faint scent of Martha's cheap strawberry shampoo, and closed my eyes against the chaos. The war was over. I had my baby back. The justice system moves slowly, but gravity catches up with everyone eventually. The months that followed the gala were a chaotic blur of legal proceedings, depositions, and courtroom theatrics. Mark, desperate and cornered, tried to plead temporary insanity. When that failed, he threw Jessica entirely under the bus, claiming she was the mastermind behind the trust fund theft and the fake church outreach program. It didn't work. The federal judge didn't buy a single tear Mark shed on the stand. In the end, they were both sentenced to decades in federal prison for conspiracy, massive financial fraud, extortion, and severe child endangerment. I wasn't in the courtroom to hear the judge slam the gavel. I didn't care to watch Mark be led away in handcuffs or see the terror in his eyes when he realized his silver tongue couldn't save him. My vengeance was already complete. That morning, instead of sitting in a sterile courthouse, I was standing in a sunlit kitchen teaching my daughter how to flip blueberry pancakes without burning the edges. I officially medically retired from the Army that spring. I sold the suffocating, pristine suburban house where Mark had built his lies. and I used a fraction of the recovered estate money to buy a modest, warm brick ranch house. It was exactly a quarter-mile down the gravel road from Martha's trailer park. We became a strange, fiercely protective, chosen family. Martha practically lived on my front porch, shelling peas, leaning on her heavy wooden cane, and ruthlessly critiquing television game shows. Leo came over every Saturday, and he and Chloe would build massive blanket forts in the living room, eating more pizza rolls than any pediatrician would ever recommend. But healing is not cinematic. It is not a clean, linear montage of smiles and sunshine. Trauma leaves deep, jagged scars, and love does not possess a magic wand to erase them overnight. It was 3 a.m., about 2 months after Mark's arrest. I woke up to a harsh, stinging chemical smell burning my nostrils. Panic instantly spiked in my chest. I threw off the covers and sprinted down the hallway. The kitchen lights were blindingly bright. Chloe was on her hands and knees. She had a rough sponge and a heavy jug of raw bleach. She was scrubbing the linoleum floor with such frantic, terrified aggression that the skin around her little knuckles was cracked and bleeding. She was hyperventilating, tears streaming down her pale face, chanting a breathless, broken mantra. "Chloe," I gasped, dropping to my knees beside her. She violently recoiled, scrambling backward until her spine hit the lower cabinets. She pulled her knees to her chest, her eyes wide and completely unseeing. "I'm cleaning it! I'm cleaning it!" she sobbed, trembling so hard her teeth chattered. "The church people said dirty girls get locked in the dark closet. I have to be clean. Please don't lock me in the dark." My heart shattered into dust. Mark was rotting in a federal cell, but his poison was still actively coursing through my daughter's mind. I didn't try to take the sponge from her. I didn't tell her to calm down. I just crawled forward over the wet, bleach-soaked linoleum, ignoring the harsh chemical burn seeping through my sweatpants, and pulled her into my lap. She fought me for a terrifying second, her rigid little fists pushing against my chest, before she finally collapsed. I rocked her right there on the wet kitchen floor for 3 hours until the sun crept over the horizon. I held her tight, whispering over and over into her hair that the closet doors in this house didn't even have locks. The progress we made was measured in micromillimeters. It was Chloe leaving her bedroom door cracked open an inch at night. It was her eating a full plate of food without asking for permission first. The real breakthrough didn't happen with dramatic fireworks or a sweeping emotional speech. It happened on a random, mundane Tuesday morning. I was standing in the laundry room, mindlessly folding a basket of warm towels, my thoughts a million miles away. From down the hall, Chloe's voice rang out. It was casual, slightly annoyed, and completely normal. "Mom, where are my blue shoes?" I froze. The towel slipped from my hands and hit the floor. Mom, not Sarah, not the terrifying monster Mark had invented. And there was no hesitation, no residual fear tethered to the word. Just a kid, safely in her house, asking her mother a completely ordinary question. I pressed my hand hard against my mouth, closing my eyes as hot, stinging tears spilled freely over my cheeks. I let myself silently cry into the darkness of my palms for exactly 10 seconds. Then I wiped my face, cleared my throat, and called back. "Did you check under the couch, baby?" 6 months later, on a bright, blindingly clear afternoon, we drove back down the gravel road of Maple Ridge Cemetery. We stood together in front of the marble headstone that still bore her name. The cemetery caretaker was there, waiting respectfully. But instead of bringing in a backhoe or heavy machinery to remove the stone, he walked forward and handed a heavy, long-handled iron mallet to me. I looked at the cold, rusted iron in my hands, then I looked down at Chloe. I knelt, my bad knee popping loudly, and held the mallet out to her. Chloe looked at me, a profound understanding passing between us. She didn't hesitate. She reached out and took the heavy mallet in both of her small hands. She took a deep, steadying breath, stepped right up to the grave that had stolen a year of our lives, and swung with all her might. The iron struck the center of the marble with a deafening crack. A jagged fissure spider-webbed directly across the carved letters of her name. She gritted her teeth and swung again. The marble shattered into 3 massive chunks, crumbling into the dirt where it belonged. The lie was physically, permanently destroyed. Chloe dropped the mallet in the grass. She turned and grabbed my hand, her fingers interlacing with mine. Her grip was tight, warm, and entirely unshakable. We turned our backs on the rubble and walked away toward the sun.